recording. Hello, welcome to the New York State Political Science Association History and Politics panel. We have Ashley Bozian as our moderator for this panel. And Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you for introductions, and then you could pass it off to our presenters. After that, we can, of course, have questions and answers.
All right, Dr. Cody, thank you so much. The title of this panel is African American Leaders in Local and Federal Politics. Dr. Christopher Cody is a historian of modern Middle East politics. He teaches in the New York metro area, and his research interests concern the role of technology in revolutionary movements. My name is Ashley Bozian. My dissertation, currently in progress and nearing completion, is Gender, Sex, and the Body in Early Medieval Armenia. And our panelists today are David Gachigo and Michael Boston. David Gachigo is a doctoral student in world history at St. John's University in New York. His dissertation focuses on Africa and international education and the role of American education's influence on Africa's future leaders. Michael Boston is an associate professor at the college at Brockport in their African and African American Studies department. He teaches courses in African American history and on the Underground Railroad. He also enjoys conducting research in public history, the Underground Railroad, and biographies. So our first panel will be by David Gachigo, and his paper is titled Obama's Soft Power and the Development of Future African Leaders. David, please go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, David, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Christopher, and of course, for being part of this important panel. So my paper is titled Obama Soft Power, Development of Future African Leaders, and sort of ties in terms of my interest in international affairs in Africa and education, if you will. And so for me, I wanted to look at the Obama presidency and understand the dynamics of his foreign policy in regard to US-Africa relations. And so for me, the beginning part of understanding Obama's presidency, it goes back to the Presidential Policy Directive of 2013, because then it helps sort of create this picture of how things are unraveling within the administration and some of the interests in relation to Africa. And so some of the things that the administration really focusing on was on democracy, human rights, economic empowerment, and health as well. So in relation to the engagement in Africa, Obama looks Africa differently in terms of trying to get away from this culture of handout. And so it's what he says, not aid, but trade. So, again, empowering Africans by providing economic opportunities so that, Africa can do the heavy lifting on themselves, right, on the future of destiny of their continent. But also think to understand all this in context, you have to go back and look in terms of what is the connection with Obama and Africa. And the one of the important things that is important to understand is Obama's father, originally from Kenya, came to America in the 1959 through what is called the African Student Airlift, and was a movement where over 700 African students were brought to America from the British colonies of East and Central Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, as well as Zanzibar at the time, and Zambia. And the idea was for them to come study in America so that when the countries became independent, there will be the new technocrats in those countries. And so one of the recipients of the funding was Barack Obama Sr., who comes to America and goes to University of Hawaii. And from that perspective, he gets a financial assistance through what is called the African American Student Foundation, a foundation that had been created as a vehicle to fundraise for these students. Because when the students came to America, all this was private funding. It was not a government initiative. The British government was against the idea of bringing the East and Central Africans to America, because at the time when they come into America, it's the height of the civil rights era. And the argument was if you allow the students to come to America, they will get radicalized. And so when they went back, they'll push for independence. And so that sort of created the challenges in terms of one, getting the students here, but also the funding. And so through the African American Student Foundation, the nonprofit created a fund that helped in, sustaining the students while they were in America, and giving them some funding to continue, living expenses while they were here. And so Obama Senior, as he goes to University of Hawaii, receives one of the, was called Jackie Robinson, the legend baseball player, who was part of the board for the African American Student Foundation. And so that experience is what I argue that shaped Barack Obama's policy on Africa, because it creates an experience. And when you hear the President Obama speaking, even during the 2010, when he launched what he calls the Young African Leadership Initiative, he argues that he's trying to use this opportunity to pay forward to those that brought his father's generation to study in America. So for him, by sort of launching this empowerment program, he's paying back for those that brought his father here. And so he argues that that is what shaped his view in terms of how his administration relates to Africa. And so he looks in terms of, for Africa to move forward, one, Africans have to take this on their own, but also the dynamics have to shift from how we see it from aid to trade perspective. And so in laying out the foundation of this empowerment, in terms of the points, the human rights, the democracy, the economic empowerment, and health as well. So his administration now is refocusing in terms of perspective on Africa. And so what he does in terms of his perspective now, he's engaging with the African leaders, but at the same time, he's taking every single opportunity to make sure he's staying connected to the young Africans. Remember, this is a continent that has 60% of its population is below the age of 35. So you have these young people who are very tech savvy, connected to the web, if you will, to the social media and what have you. And so he looks at this opportunity that these are the people that can change things. So for example, if you look in Kenya, for example, during his presidency, we have these young people who, helped in his sort of Yes We Can movement. On the Kenyan side, for example, you have these young Kenyans who are calling themselves Yes Youth Can. And so they use similar platform to move the agenda. They use similar platform to move the discussion to a different level. And so when issues come up, for example, the issue of human rights, issues of good governance, issues of corruption, they have a bigger platform because they have a bigger say and they are well connected. So Obama sees an opportunity with the goodwill that the Africans sort of endure him. His presidency is celebrated widely at the time when he becomes president. So for example, if you look in Kenya, when Obama becomes president, the Kenyan president says Obama's election is a win not only for America, but also for us here because we connect with him. He's also what we call a son of the soil, meaning part of his family, they're based in East Africa and really in Kenya. So, for example, in Kenya, it becomes a national holiday the day that is, Obama wins presidency. So there is that important connection in terms of, in relation to what is happening at the time. And so for Barack Obama, he uses that goodwill to leverage now his policy in what I call the soft power approach, because he, being considered a son of the soil, he can say things that are considered taboo to the African leaders. He can say things to the African, so-called African strongmen and autocratic leaders that we need to go left and not right. We need to change things. And so he is viewed differently because now you're not dealing with the issue of racial difference. He's one of you, he's one of them, and he's arguing in terms of this is not good for the future of Africa. This is not good for the future of specific countries. And so when he, starts engaging in Africa, the meetings he sets, for example, he meets with the president of Sierra Leone, Senegal, Malawi. He's being very strategic in terms of the people that he's speaking to meet with, because he's looking at the countries that have shown progress. They've shown, open democracies, elections are happening. And so he uses that opportunity to showcase those particular countries, to push this idea that democracy works, to push this idea that good governance works. And so if all other countries can follow that direction, it's good for the African continent. And so this gives him leverage. The other part of this argument is when he makes, for example, his tours, when he travels to the African countries and for his engagement, he made sure, for example, he had a chance to meet with the youth. And so he had those one-on-one town hall, what he calls town hall, to talk about his vision of the continent, his vision for the young people, and challenging the young people to take their rightful place, which at some point, in some cases, did not resonate well with the leadership of some of these countries, because again, the young people who were tech savvy were sort of making the leaders in the countries uncomfortable. And so this became sort of the rallying cry from the Obama administration in terms of moving Africa. And so when in 2010, they created YALI, what they call the Young African Leadership Initiative, the idea is to empower these young Africans. You give them the sort of the human capacity that they need to become better leaders in the civil societies, in the social entrepreneurship, in works around human rights. And so by empowering them, then they have the ability to sort of connect with the peers within each country or even the continent. And so you have this movement that is being built through these efforts. And of course, through the help of the State Department, because the consulates during the Obama administration played a key role in making this happen. There was funding that came through to help in capacity building. There were grants that were provided to the young African leaders. And then, of course, the functioning of this process of the YALI initiative took the Africans from the age of 18 to 35, which is part of this big population, and sort of worked with them, empowered them to be part of this process. Then, in looking at the countries, the process was expanded. So they built 4 regional centers, what they call YALI regional centers, 2 in West Africa, 1 in Senegal, 1 in Ghana, 1 in South Africa for the southern region, and 1 in Kenya for the East African region. And they were specifically selected because, again, those countries sort of they had influence within the region. So again, this was an idea for the Obama presidency to look at who are the influencers in terms of these countries. In terms, when you look at the geopolitical affairs of those particular regions. And then, of course, helping these centers come up and also connecting the centers within themselves. So over time, you had over 50,000 people that were connected. And so when issues were happening in one country, they were connected to these young people on a different part of the continent. So it helped in building the movement. And then, of course, this went to a different level. In 2014, Obama then looks at this idea and then expands YALI to what now they are calling it the Mandela Washington Fellows. And so what happens is in 2014, when he visits South Africa, he decides to launch this program. And the idea is now to take some of the applicants who apply for this program and bring them to the United States. So where about 600 or more of these young leaders, African leaders, come to America in the about 32 institutions of higher learning here, who host these young Africans during summertime for courses on leadership, good governance, business courses, and then also get contacts with the American leaders in the private and public sector, and then get a chance to spend in Washington, D.C. meeting with government leadership. So again, that program expanded where now the Africans were able to come to America, connect to see the American university perspective, similar to the, again, program we talked about, the 1959 airlift. and then connect them with the American leaders. What this does is that the American Obama administration is creating networks, because now as these young Africans go back to their respective countries, they are connected to the State Department. And so this was critical because it helped in sort of addressing the US-African relations. It helped in creating partners in what Obama talks about, the need for mutual respect partnership. So helping creating partners with these young African leaders. And the intention was, down the road, the future of US-Africa relations will be better because you have young men and women who are favorable to the American perspective, who are favorable to the American ideals, and so becomes a partner for the Americans. And so the Obama administration was, sort of strategic in terms of moving this needle to a next level and bring them these students from Africa to the United States. And so over the years, the program has been growing, and the intention is to continue, supporting both YALI and the Mandela Washington Fellows. And also, it's important also to know, to indicate why, again, the program is, changes the name to sort of the Mandela Washington Fellows. And Obama specifically argues it is important to pay homage to the African leaders. And in this case, meaning Nelson Mandela, because when in 2014, he was talking about the Mandela Washington Fellows Program, which was originally known as the Washington Fellows Program. So it was changed to Mandela in honoring Nelson Mandela. But also this is happening at the in Soweto, which is sort of the original homeland of Nelson Mandela, where there was a lot of youth activism. And so there's a lot of symbolism in terms of what Obama does, in terms of interacting with the young people, in terms of his specific travels in this continent. And even, every place he travels, he argues the need for consideration of the African, young African leaders, and not forgetting the women as well in sort of this perspective. But also I think on the other hand, in terms of this soft power, Obama then decides in terms of how he's gonna engage with the continent, because from the argument you would have thought in his first travels to Africa, Obama would have favored East Africa, where again, because of his historical and family connection. But for example, Obama avoids East Africa and avoids Kenya because at the time, Kenya is caught up in post-election violence, and the people running for election in 2013 find themselves at the International Criminal Court. So Obama administration avoids that region and argues that that is not a good indicator in terms of the values that we stand for and what we expect for the continent. And so Obama goes back to Kenya towards the tail end of the second administration, because at the time now, the president and the deputy president charges have been cleared at the ICC. So now he's coming back and showing, this is what it's all about. This is what democracy is all about, and how we need to move forward. So again, I argue in terms of his strategy and how he engages with the continent, because he saw the opportunities, but also was not, shying away in sort of calling a spade. And so again, at some point, making it uncomfortable for the African leaders. And you see this, when he's dealing with the issue of Zimbabwe, because at the time of during George W. Bush administration, the sanctions that were put in Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe's considered autocratic rule, Obama continues to enforce the policies. And he's rewarding young Zimbabweans who are fighting Robert Mugabe. So he honors two of the honorees with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award in Washington. And he argues he's doing this in terms of to honor the work that the people are doing in Zimbabwe, despite the challenges and they've been put under Robert Mugabe and his dictatorial tendencies. And so, again, the symbolism I talked about, the idea of doing what is right and engaging with the Africans and sort of calling, in terms of when they sort of don't follow guidelines, in terms of expectation really of norms, democratic norms. So again, his administration becomes very strategic in terms of how he engages in Africa. The third point, I would say, the economic part. the economic empowerment of Africa, where Obama has argued instead of going for aid, let's go for trade, he commits money to the continent. And so, for example, in partnership with the private sector in 2013, there's about $33 billion that he commits to the continent in various projects for young people, for green energy, for example, what they call the green revolution, investment in African food security, because again, a hungry country becomes an unstable country. And so talking about how you empower farmers, help farmers stand on their 2 feet to be able to move address the food insecurity issues. And he does this, again, from the soft power approach to counter China that is, at the time, moving in the African continent with huge vigor. Remember, China is coming with so much resources in the continent, and what China is doing is China is not getting concerned with some of these human rights records for some of these African leaders, and so the non-interference policy is what sort of helps China in growing its footprint in the continent. Massive infrastructure projects happening in the continent vis-a-vis Chinese funding. And so the Obama administration moves in and tries to tackle that and uses the carrot and stick good governance argument to tackle China. The challenge is, the African leaders need the funding. And so they see this money coming from China and they can't say no. And so now that becomes the challenge because again, the countries want to grow, there's economic opportunities. But again, since the Chinese are not willing to address those issues, creates a headache for the Obama administration. And so the road to take was, again, use the young African leaders to challenge some of the economic practices that the governments were getting involved in, to challenge this idea of debt trap, if you will, because again, at some point, as you borrow from China, you have to pay this money. And so some of the structures of these loans became a huge debate amongst these African countries. And so the young people become the vehicle to challenge and ask questions about those dealings with the Chinese. And so again, Obama administration relied on the young people to try to address the Chinese question without really dealing with the African leaders. Because again, at the end of the day, this idea of sovereignty among the African countries, made it difficult for Obama to be seen as if trying to pressure the Africans. So again, the young people, and for example, Kenya was one of the countries where question came up in terms of the aid and how the money was being spent in some of these projects, and we talk about corruption. So you could see a footprint, and what this does is it starts creating some levels of uncomfortability among some of these countries, where now you start seeing there's taxes coming within the social media industry. Social media being taxed because the governments are trying to limit the young people usage of social media. So again, for me, the argument is that Obama could do this through the avenue of using, the young Africans who are eager and ready to sort of take the mantle of leadership from the old political elite, albeit under difficult circumstances. But again, there was hope from his perspective, and the idea was to try and empower these young African leaders to move that mantle. So again, that is sort of how I see it in terms of the Obama presidency in relation to U.S.-African relations.
All right, David, thank you so much for that really interesting paper. I learned so much. There was so much that I didn't know about. And I already have so many questions, but Chris, would you like to go forward with Michael's paper, or do you think we should do questions in between?
No, we can go. Let's do both presentations, and then we can see if we can figure out any connecting questions that would kind of draw connections between the two papers. And also, by the way, David, very, very interesting. I learned a lot there, and I have some
Thank you.
questions for you, but I'm looking forward to the next presentation. So why don't we move on to that? Does that sound good?
Thank you.
All right, so our next paper is by Michael Boston. His paper is titled Sherman L. Walker, Local Grassroots Councilman. And Michael, whenever you're ready. Michael, it looks like you're on mute as well.
No, I'm trying to get this where you can see my PowerPoint presentation. Let's see, share screen. Okay, can everybody see that?
Perfect. I could see it. Yep.
Okay, let's see. Slideshow. Let's see, slideshow. Okay, yeah, all right. Okay, I chose an individual who I learned about in working on my dissertation. I interviewed a gentleman, Jesse Nash Jr., whose father was the minister of a very prominent church in Buffalo, New York. And I was interviewing him on African Americans in Buffalo in the early part of the 20th century. And he told me about Sherman L. Walker, pretty much that he was a grassroots political leader. So when we look at Sherman L. Walker, he was born in 1892 in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the South, in the Upper South, not the Deep South, where the racism was more intense. At least that's what the literature highlights. He was fortunate in the sense that he was able to go to high school, and he had graduated from Burleigh High School in Burleigh, Virginia, in 1910. And as he's coming of age, World War I starts, and as we all know, that was characterized as the war to save democracy for the world. And Sherman L. Walker happened to volunteer and join that war, but unfortunately for him, he was placed in segregated units. So as some of us know, the United States, from the Civil War up until World War II, African Americans were segregated from whites in terms of fighting in warfare. So when we look at World War I, you have something like 370,000 African Americans that participated in it. About 100,000 of them saw warfare in Europe, and Sherman L. Walker was one of these individuals that saw warfare in Europe. When the war was over, he was discharged at the rank of a sergeant. So as the war is over, he comes back to Virginia. He's looking around, figuring out what he's going to get involved in next. And what's going on in the United States is the first Great Migration. And in the first Great Migration, it takes place from about 1914 to about 1919. And he gets caught up in that. And there are push factors that are pushing, African Americans out of the South, and there's a pull factor, which is the main one, is jobs pulling them to the North. So he gets attracted. So he leaves Virginia and he comes to Buffalo, New York. And when he comes to Buffalo, New York, he has a number of factory type jobs. He gets married to a woman named Betsy. They make a life for themselves in Buffalo, New York, but he reasons to himself that he can do better. And what he does is he attends the University of Buffalo, and he attends the School of Anatomy, and he's going to graduate in 1925. So he learns a lot about the human body, and he ultimately becomes a mortician. He becomes this mortician, and in Buffalo, he's located on Clinton Avenue, and that's the 5th Ward. If you look at the history of Buffalo, New York, when the Second Great Migration was taking place, the African-American community resided around the downtown area, around Michigan Street. I mentioned Reverend Jesse Nash Sr. He had his church in that area. So when they were migrating up, they clustered around in that area, which is called the Fifth Ward. So he opens up a funeral parlor or a funeral home on Clinton Avenue. And he connects with the people very much so. And he has a very friendly personality, and people like him and he likes them. And that's going to motivate him to become a politician, because he doesn't see any African Americans in city government. And he reasons to himself that there's some issues that need to be addressed. And in 1933, he's going to run for Fifth Ward. I mean, today they call them councilmen, but in those days they were called ward supervisors. So he's going to run for election, and he's going to win. And this is, of course, during the Great Depression. So when he runs as a Republican. And from 1965, not 1965, from 1865, when the Civil War is over, most African Americans are, they embrace the Republican Party. Why? Because they associate themselves with the great emancipator, which is Abraham Lincoln, and they reason that he had a hand in helping free the enslaved persons, so they're going to identify with that party. And Sherman L. Walker, when he runs for political office, he runs as a Republican, and as I'm implying and saying, most African Americans are Republicans. But when Franklin D. Roosevelt comes along, when he runs for election in 1932, by 1936, the African-American population is leaning towards the Democratic Party. But one unique thing about Buffalo, African-Americans had a tendency to hang on to the Republican Party to about 1949. But so Sherman L. Walker, he's in office, and he's he's the ward person or ward head of the Fifth Ward. Here's a map of the Fifth Ward. I know it's not very clear, but if you were able to look at this very closely, you could see some of the streets that are part of the Fifth Ward. And the Fifth Ward, because of this first Great Migration, they're getting more and more African Americans that are coming into the Buffalo community. And as they're coming in, some of them are being relegated to the Fifth Ward where the African Americans are, and then some of them are moving there on their own because they want to be around people that look like them. Some of them have come to Buffalo and they've been recruited by family members or relatives or what have you, and they're living around them in the Fifth Ward. But the point I'm making is the population in the Fifth Ward is increasing as a result of this first Great Migration. So from 1933 to 1949, Sherman L. Walker, he worked to ensure that his constituents received a fair share of city resources. During the Great Depression, he being a Republican, he supported a number of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs. Understandably, bread lines for needy people, the Social Security Act of 1935, which gave beginnings of giving Social Security to Americans. Unfortunately, initially it excluded farm laborers and domestic workers. So initially, a lot of the African Americans were excluded from that. He supported the Wagner Act, which basically said that labor unions, workers had a right to have representation from labor unions. And he also supported the Fair Labor Standards Act, which guaranteed a minimum wage. And if you went over 40 hours, that you were supposed to be paid time and a half. And there were other things that he supported, but he also supported Executive Order 8802, which Franklin D. Roosevelt passed. And basically that said that the people in the defense industry that had government contracts during World War II, they were not supposed to discriminate. And if they did, they could be investigated, and perhaps the funds directed to their business could be diverted somewhere else. So this Executive Order 8802 is very important because it's going to help give momentum to the second Great Migration, which is going to take place during World War II. And that's going to also pull more and more people up to Buffalo and other northern communities. Now, in terms of local politics, Sherman L. Walker was abreast of things. And as I've said earlier, he tried to make sure that his people got a fair share of city resources and that city operations operated efficiently and fairly in the Fifth Ward. But here's a particular example. The mayor of Buffalo in 1947, Mayor Bernard J. Dowd, he called a meeting because taxi cab drivers that had meters, they were complaining that library cab operators were taking a lot of their business. Taxi cab drivers had, they legally could go about the city and pick up people random and also take phone calls, whereas these library cab operators were supposed to strictly take phone calls to go and pick someone up, but they were picking people up randomly. So the mayor called the meeting and he wanted to try to stop this process, but Sherman L. Walker was one of the persons that spoke up for these library cab drivers because a lot of them were catering to people in his ward that were taking them to their places of employment. So you can see here, here's a direct quote from him: "The number of taxi cabs in Buffalo is insufficient to meet the human needs of the people today. The library operators are doing a good job, and the integrity of the Negro people is in jeopardy if we are denied the opportunities of operating these library cabs." He also commented, as I looked through the newspaper, he commented on social issues that were going about at the particular point in time. And, this is in the Jim Crow era of American history, and the effects of it are very blatant in the South, and they're also apparent in the North. So he was, commented on issues of the day. And here's the case of Mary Marshall. She was a 5-year-old biracial child who her mother, who happened to be white, allowed the child to go and stay with the grandparent. Grandmother in particular refused to return the child because she said that the mother and father were unfit. Now, this case was supposed to be settled by a judge. Sherman L. Walker commented on that. And the thing that he said was, marry this 5-year-old child. If she resided in the African-American community, the African-American community would view her as a human being and treat her as a human being and would not discriminate against her or her mother. Also on the local level, Sherman L. Walker was, we hear a lot about Black Lives Matters today and police officers shooting African-American males. Sherman L. Walker had the experience as a community leader. He was asked to investigate a case in which an African-American man was found hung in his jail cell. Now, many of the people in the community thought he was murdered. The police officer said he committed suicide. So Sherman L. Walker, being a mortician, he observed the individual's body, and he came to the assessment that this individual had in fact committed suicide. And by him articulating that and that being placed in the paper, it kind of soothed a lot of the unrest that happened in the community. So Sherman L. Walker, he's not only a politician, he grows to be a person that the community respects, and they call upon him to represent the community in a lot of different forms beyond just the political aspect. Now, he crossed party lines. In 1941, he supported an individual that ran for the mayorship, Judge Joseph J. Kelly. And Kelly supported Franklin D. Roosevelt New Deal measures. And one of the things that he emphasized, that he was going to help to ensure that the 5-cent bus rate was charge, and Sherman L. Walker supported that for school children. And Judge Joseph J. Kelly, he in fact did win the mayorship. So from time to time, Sherman L. Walker, he crossed, political lines. Now, some of the points I can say about him, when I interviewed Jesse Nash Jr., he told me that he remembered that Sherman L. Walker, people that could not afford funerals, that he would actually bury them for free. Jesse Nash Jr. said he did that in a lot of instances, and that helped endear him to the community, and of course, that's going to help him get reelected. He went and spoke throughout various churches, and he tended to follow a policy that some of the people in the South would follow. People like, Booker T. Washington, oftentimes when he spoke in the South, after he got finished speaking, he would have a quartet of singers that would sing after him. And Sherman L. Walker tended to follow this policy as well. I mean, his wife was one of the persons that would sing after he spoke at a community event. And he didn't just speak in Buffalo, not just a leader in Buffalo, but the local area as well. In Rochester, New York, he participated in a ceremony that was going to honor Frederick Douglass at the AME Zion Church. They had a march to the Frederick Douglass statue, and then they came back to the church and speeches were given. He also welcomed Oscar de Priest. Some of you that know about African-American political history, Oscar de Priest was the first African-American elected to Congress after 1901, when George White left the Congress. When Reconstruction turned around, and a lot of African-American politicians were being unseated. So Oscar de Priest, came to political office in Congress in 1828, and he was a great symbol for African-American communities throughout the country. So he came to Buffalo, New York, and Sherman L. Walker was part of a committee that actually welcomed him. So there are a lot of community things that Sherman L. Walker did to endear himself to the African-American community. And this contributed to him being elected from 1933 all the way up until 1949. There was a 2-year period where he didn't run, but he served in office for about 14 years. So in 1949, Leland Jones Jr. happened to be the politician that unseated him. And Leland Jones Jr. was a Democrat. And when Leland Jones Jr. Won a seat as the 5th Ward council supervisor, that's when the African-American community in Buffalo began to massively change from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. So when Sherman L. Walker lost his seat, he continued to be a community leader. He was still seen in that mode. He continued to operate his funeral home with his wife. It was a very prosperous funeral home. Some of the sources that I have seen have said that he was one of the first African-American millionaires in Buffalo. I don't know if that's true, but that's what some people have tended to write about him. His wife died in 1968. And about 1 year later, Sherman L. Walker would die in a tragic fire incident at his home, which was the funeral home as well. A fire occurred, and he and 3 of his grandsons died in the fire. And the records that have been left have said that the fire chief said that he could have escaped himself, but he tried to rescue his grandchildren. So when we look at the legacy of Sherman L. Walker, a couple things I can say. He looked out for the political interests of citizens in the 5th Ward, Black as well as white citizens, no matter what their race, ethnicity were. He operated, as I've said before, during a highly discriminatory period. and he tried to obtain civil rights and respectability for his people, as well as other people in the Fifth Ward. And today, old timers and well-informed, politicians here in Buffalo, particularly African-American politicians, they see Sherman L. Walker as the father of politics amongst Black Buffalonians. So when you look at political history here, people will tend to go back and say, well, you got to bring up Sherman L. Walker because he laid the foundation. There was a politician, I'm trying to remember his name. He retired not too long ago and passed away recently. And in his speech, he made reference to Sherman L. Walker. So I would just conclude by saying, as Jesse Nash said, that he was a grassroots politician, very personable person, and was highly respected, down-to-earth person, Sherman L. Walker. Okay. Right.
Michael, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I have never learned about Sherman L. Walker before, so I have so many questions for both of you. Chris, would you like to jump in, or should we just kind of approach this like a round table? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's it's kind of an informal roundtable. I mean, I have one unifying question that I identified after having listened to both of you. So maybe I could kick the conversation off with that, and then everyone can feel free to jump in. I know Ashley, you have some questions as well. Maybe David and Michael have questions for each other. But the question first off, the identifying theme that I noticed between Barack Obama as well as Sherman L. Walker is this ethos of giving back. Whether you're giving back, as David said, as a son of the soil, giving back to future generations of African leaders, or whether you're Sherman L. Walker working at the grassroots level. Of course, also Obama was a grassroots politician as well. And you're trying to get expanded opportunities for your constituents. So my question for you both is, what is the political power of giving back and of making that a unifying ethos as part of your political persona? You want to be somebody who's constantly giving more and more of yourself. And I mean, even to this day, I'm sure Obama is constantly giving back to all kinds of things. And Sherman L. Walker, to his dying day, he's trying to give back by saving his grandsons, which, by the way, that's a very tragic story. So that's my question. What's the political power of giving back?
Okay. I guess I'll go first. I think the political power of giving back is, in Sherman L. Walker's case, if you give back and people see that you're true, it's going to help you continuously get reelected. You often hear about politicians, they're only around when it's voting time comes. But I get a sense from the literature that Sherman L. Walker was very much immersed in the community. And he was a very religious and a very spiritual person. He believed that the church should be heavily involved in helping to change the morality and values of the community. So I believe in his heart that he felt and believed that he had to, perform service, had to go and help people. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if people came to him and they didn't have any money and they had a loved one that wanted to be buried, he was going to do that. And I don't think he was going to blow his horn to tell everybody, hey, I freely buried so many people. I didn't charge. I just think he believed he was doing the right thing, following the golden rule, and it was going to help him politically as well, because people were going to say that he's for real, he's amongst us, he's a grassroots, he's not a symbolic leader, he's amongst the people, and I can go to him. I mean, he's at our events and he's a role model, and so on and so forth.
I think from the looking at the Obama's perspective, I think in relation to the African engagement, I think giving back, it's, for me, I see it as part of the American tradition. And so I think expanding this to a global scale, I think it helps in sort of shaping the relationship of, again, US-African relations, and how, the two continents interact with each other. But also I think it's giving back with a sense of belonging, with a sense of, what he calls partnership and mutual respect. So again, I think he's giving back sort of challenges the African leaders that you have to do your part. The heavy lifting is on you. And so I think that is what will sort of reverberate within the continent, reverberate, I think, within the both political and social platforms in other part of the continent. And I think, if you look at the Obama experience, one of the things that I see, for me, I think a connecting point, you also have to look at his administration and also look at JF Kennedy's administration, because there's a little bit of similarity in terms of this idea of giving back. And, I talk about, for example, the 1961, where Kennedy is, launching, challenging Americans to do something, and especially abroad, when he launches the Peace Corps. And so I think this also becomes a similar platform as Obama launches 50 years later, Yali, and what it means. So again, he talks about this idea of paying it forward, because I think it resonates from his experience as a community organizer and what that can do. So again, by giving back, hopefully, this sort of becomes infectious in sort of for the good of the people, for the good of the young African leaders and future leaders, if you will, and with the intention that this will go a long way.
So interesting, both of your answers. Go ahead, Ashley. Why don't you ask our panelists one of the questions?
Yeah, thank you. So David, I wanted to start with your paper. One of the questions that really came to the front of my mind as you were speaking was about these programs that Barack Obama initiated to allow and encourage African youth to study in the United States. And you've mentioned toward the end of your paper that they've been growing each year. And I was wondering, how much have they been growing, and have they maintained their momentum? Were the Trump years somewhat of a snag for them? How have they been doing under the Biden administration? Could you talk a little bit about how they've been doing since Obama left office?
Yes, so thank you, Ashley. So there was a sort of a downturn trend during the Trump presidency, because again, the sort of engagement with that part of the world was sort of seen as slower. So even though you had the program in terms of participants, I think the focus was mostly within the consulates abroad. But there was sort of, the numbers were lower compared to what you had during at the peak, when Obama left the presidency. And so now, for example, and looking at the yearly 2022 that is happening this year, it seems that Biden again is trying to re-engage with Africa, albeit differently. If you recall the comments made by the former president and what he called some of these countries. And so now, I think it helps in terms of the discussion. And again, I think, the good thing is in terms of, if you look at it, is Biden is a little bit looking at the, following the Obama footsteps. And of course, they were, in one administration. So I think that helps in terms of how the program grows. One of the Yali, the network, for example, which is sort of the at the local point, that is growing tremendously, because all you need is the consulates where they are, connecting with the young Africans that are there. The fellowship program isn't big because again, it's about 600 every year. Because those students come to America, for a few months, then they head back. But again, I think as sort of the economic trends or trajectory, I think starts moving towards in the right direction. That means there will be more resources from State Department as a disposal to sort of expand this program. So there is an opportunity, I think, also from the Biden administration understanding the challenge that, for example, China brings on the table. It's not easy because again, China is coming with a lot of money in the African continent. And so how you deal with that, it means you really have to continue engaging with young Africans because they are the future of the continent. And as we phase out the sort of the old generation, some of the leaders have been there for a long time, that space will be filled by these young leaders and some of them who have the connections in the West. And so I think it's good for America. It's good for the U.S.-Africa relations. So again, there's a hope that, again, things will start swinging going up in terms of the program. And it's very similar if you look at the numbers, for example, for the international students that come to America, with F1 visa. During the Obama years, that number continued to rise. Well, and then during the Trump presidency, the number stagnated and then, of course, started decreasing quite rapidly. And so now, with this administration, sort of welcoming back international students, you started seeing an upward trajectory. So again, it's hoped that with that, with goodwill, that the number will again start picking up.
Curious, is just a quick follow-up question, David. Are there any standout students amongst some of the Obama era Mandela Washington scholars, or have there been any agents of change that have been produced out of that program? I know that you said that a lot of the country's current leadership are a little nervous about them, right?
Yes.
So I'm curious, just if you could speak a bit to that as well.
I think one of the areas, for example, I think, for example, the honorees and if I can put the names of the honorees. Zimbabwe is one of the case studies I would argue because of the challenges in Zimbabwe. I think in looking at the people, right, who are pushing for change in Zimbabwe, would you find, that those some of the, I think at the time that where the focus was, as compared to, let's say, the other programs. So for example, in the Mandela Washington program, the students will come in for a few months and then head back. So, if you're a social entrepreneur, you would come in and then get the funding. If you're working on something dealing with the issue of malaria, you get the funding. So in terms of leadership, there haven't been any of this that I could find that have assumed sort of political offices. But the hope is down the road, they have been sort of, their feet are wet. They've tested, in terms of the ideals, America, as well as some of those leadership. And so I think as the ground sort of becomes better and better, there is more opportunity for them to be influencers in their community and be able to sort of assume some of these roles.
So interesting. Go ahead, Ashley. Do you have another question?
I do. I have a question for Michael. So as I mentioned before, I had never heard of Sherman L. Walker before. And as you were speaking, I was surprised by that because he sounded like such an influential, such an important figure. And you mentioned a little bit about his legacy and how he's well known in certain circles, or not well known, but to some extent known in certain circles. And I wanted to ask you why, if you have any thoughts on this, why he isn't quite as well known as other figures are. Do you think that there are, I don't know, it was fascinating to me. Why haven't I heard of this person who did so much?
Well, I think he's known to a degree locally. I mean, he wasn't a national politician where, even I would even think the mayor here, Byron Brown, isn't really known nationally. So I think he fits that mold. He was a local person. Now the people here, the old timers, when I say old timers, I'm talking about people in their 70s, 80s, they remember him. But I don't think the younger generation, because that history hasn't really been promoted. And I think even some of the white politicians here from earlier times, they're not known as well. I mean, perhaps a major mayor or something like that, like Mayor Sedita, but that seems to be a common trend, and that might fit a lot of places, unless people go and do the research, or they're taught this information is not going to necessarily be passed on. And that's why I would really promote like oral histories, because when you talk to some of these old timers or older people that lived through the era, they can give you information that may not be in a book, or if the information is in a book, they can give you information that that wouldn't be in that book at all, just to bring more of that individual's personality to light, and to bring it in perspective. So I think it's a trend that these local people are not known of. I mean, like I said, how I got exposed to him was by a person that lived through the era and remembered him campaigning, remember him going around with a flag, letting people know that he was president, and just being kind to other people. So I didn't know about him until to this particular interview. So I would just promote local histories, and people passing on information and receiving that, and hopefully promoting that for future generations. Yeah.
I have a couple add-on questions for you. One is, by the way, very interesting presentation. The case that he commented on with the young biracial girl, Mary, I can't remember the last name. Did you ever track down the end of that story? Did they ever figure out what happened to that young girl?
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't track down the end of the story, but I can't really see the judge taking the child away. From the paper, I got a sense that the mother was resentful, the fact that her daughter married an African-American male. She was 24 and he was 32. She asked if she could keep the daughter, if the granddaughter could visit. She just didn't let her go. So I don't know the results, but the way it was written in the paper was like, I can't let my granddaughter stay in that setting with those two unfit people. But well, I don't know. I don't know the result. But
clearly they went to him as a community leader to comment on it.
Yeah.
And then, so he was in office, I believe you said, was it 14 years? Was that correct?
Yeah, from 1933 to 1949, and there was a 2-year gap in between. So he was in there for 14 years. So he would get elected every 2 years. So he was very successful in terms of getting elected. And the 5th ward was, you had African Americans and you also had whites in there as well.
And it's always so interesting to me to remember that, the Democrats, of course, Obama is a Democrat, right? And Democrats do not always represent African Americans. And I was wondering if you said he was running as a Republican, right? One of the last Republicans.
Yeah, he was a Republican throughout his tenure. Yeah.
And he lost in 1949 or 1948. Yes. Do you think that's the reason that he was slow to transition over to the Democratic Party? Maybe if he had, would he have held on to his political power in the 5th ward?
No, I don't think it was. Well, maybe that had a little to do with it, but I think the communities saw Leland Jones Jr. as an up and coming charismatic person, and they were attracted to him, and they wanted a change. So throughout the papers, he's really given a lot of credit as a exciting, impactful person. So I think they were looking for change, and then the fact that he was a Democrat, and then African American populations is shifting towards the Democratic Party. And like I said, in 49, that's when they made the massive change when he was elected. So from what I read, he was just a exciting, charismatic person, and they wanted a change. As a matter of fact, Sherman L. Walker ran. They began to change from ward supervisors to councilmen. And Sherman L. Walker ran against him for a council seat in the Maston district, and he lost. Leland Jones won that election. So people were looking for a change, and Leland, he was an exciting person. Interesting. And charismatic as well.
There's another connecting factor to Barack Obama, charismatic and interesting politician. This has been really, really interesting so far. Ashley, do you have another question?
I do, but one thing I wanted to jump on is that Michael, this sounds he sounds like a great person to write a book about. So if you haven't thought about it, I would love to read a book about this person. So if the book hasn't been written, you should write it. I'll read it.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Doing local history, it's especially if there's not a lot of records, and even if there are a few records, it's a lot. It's a lot of work. So for Sherman L. Walker, I'm just scratching the surface. It's like you really got to dig and dig and dig. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that lived during his era and would know him, they're passing away. So, but I want to write a good, strong article on him for sure. Yeah.
That's why, like you said, the importance of oral history. How
Yeah.
important
Yeah,
it is to get it now.
Please let us know when the article drops. Send us an
Okay.
email.
Well, I got a question for David if nobody else.
Please.
David, I enjoyed your presentation, and as you were giving your presentation, you mentioned a point where Obama was highlighting for Africa self-help as opposed to aid. And what I thought about is when he ran for the presidency, he tried to stay away from issues of race. And really, he stayed away. He didn't want to associate too much with the African-American community because I believe he thought some whites would think if he gets in office, he's going to do more for Blacks than he will for the country and for whites. So I'm asking you, do you think that fitted into his philosophy in terms of Africa? I'm not going to give them handouts, because even when he campaigned, you probably remember, he went to a church, spoke at an African-American church, and he was talking about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and how fathers were, African-American men needed to be fathers. They needed to fulfill their roles. So I'm curious in terms of conservatives, what they thought about his American political conservatives. What did they think about his approach in Africa in terms of helping? And what I said, how do you think it fits in his approach there?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think that's a very interesting question, because I think that becomes one of the points in terms of how he deals with Africa. Because I think when you look from the East African perspective, when people are celebrating Obama's win, people are talking about this government largesse that is going to flow to the continent. And I think I would argue, yes, I think that played a role in terms of trying to be neutral in terms of how he is viewed on the continent, because especially during the first administration, you're coming in as the first administration, but you want to be reelected. So you have to be very careful in terms of how you present yourself, and to be seen that you're being inclusive, that, at the end of the day, you're the president of the United States. You're not the president of the African continent. And so you have to cater for the American interests first. So even when he goes to Africa, he's still bringing in tons of American entrepreneurs to invest in the continent. And so he looks at it in terms of America first, even though now what he emphasizes this idea of partnership and mutual respect. So from his perspective, we are not helping, but we want to work with you and provide make sure your institutions work for the betterment of the rest of the people.
Okay. All right. Did the conservatives attack his position at all? Do you know if he?
Yeah, I think I did come across, because I was looking for anything written in terms of Obama foreign policy, and there is an argument from the conservative side that he didn't do much for the African continent, and so they paint him as a person you have the connection to the African continent, yet you didn't do much. Instead, actually, they talk of his hard power in terms of, for example, places like Joseph Kony in Uganda, and Somalia fighting Al-Shabaab. So Obama is, and also if you could recall the issue of Libya, they paint him as, getting involved in this conflict in the continent, and that he's not doing better things for the African. Instead, he's not addressing he's not helping them actually. And so they talk about a failed time in helping Africa.
Okay.
And I would also think the Benghazi was probably, they're keeping everything in North Africa, right? In the Horn of
Yes.
Africa, and not
Yes.
considering what's going on south of that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
One quick follow-up question, David, just, I'm curious, you're originally from Kenya, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you have any personal memories? Because you said that Obama is a son of the soil. Do you have and you mentioned how it was a national holiday when he was elected. Do you have personal memories? How did it feel as a Kenyan to have somebody who's a Kenyan American become president? What does that mean to the
I
wider?
think there was I mean, for me, it was euphoric, right? Because you're talking a person that, I think for us is, there's what I would call the African socialism. You are still connected. This is something, for example, in Kenya, they call Harambee, pulling together. So for example, Harambee is, you see in the coat of arms in Kenya. So it's the idea of pulling together. And so what happens is, by the fact that his father is from Kenya, there's this idea of, the euphoria that comes with this expectation, right? And, people, start resonating, for example, with what they call the Kennedy airlift, the Mboya airlift. These are the students I've brought here, in connecting the father who came in and, now Barack Obama. So there is that connection. And of course, when Obama goes to Kenya in 2015, he says, when he's doing one of his addresses, the opening remarks, he says, I am the first Kenyan American president. So, again, he says right there, because there is that connection. And, when he's speaking, for example, what we call Sheng. Sheng is a mixture of English and Swahili, right? That's what mostly the young people speak. So he's trying to connect with them, and talks about his appearance. Remember, Obama spent some time when he finished college, he spent some time in Kenya with his, the other half part of his family, and talk about his experience in Kenya, right? And so there is that connection. So there was this euphoric, and especially on the quote unquote province where the dad came from. So it was, for me, watching from this side of the Atlantic, it was just like amazing, and to have that feeling. But also I think also a little bit understanding some of the international politics in terms of what this means.
Okay.
So interesting.
Mike, I had a question for you. Thank you for sharing, because I think when you talk about Sean Walker, what I remember for me is the Buffalo politics, because I think not too long ago there was a candidate, I think it was a socialist candidate, I think a lady who was running for office. And I wonder whether, there's any sort of influence connection. Is that something that has to do with the Buffalo politics? Is this something that resonates as compared to the traditional party? I'm just your view, your take on it, yeah.
Well, I'm trying to remember the young lady's name.
I don't recall, yeah, but I do remember there was,
yeah. I know her. Yeah, she ran on. Well, people interpret her as a socialist.
Yeah.
I think she would identify with Sherman L. Walker in the sense of his affinity and closeness to the people, grassroots level, because she argued that that's where she began, like Barack Obama, in terms of working for poor people in the Fruit Belt area and trying to improve their condition, and attacking the current mayor based on the neglect of the African American community. That one should start from the bottom and work up. That seemed to have been her approach, and that resonated with a lot of people, because she won the what the Democratic primary.
Primary, yeah.
Yeah, and they had the write-in to get Byron Brown on the ballot. But I believe that she would identify with Sherman L. Walker very, very much so. Now, she's a young person. If she wants to make a career in politics, I think that she could be successful. I think she needs to start and continue to build a name for herself, name recognition, and then she ultimately will perhaps be elected to other positions. What Byron Brown did, the current mayor, he used the fear factor. He, pointed out and argued that and implied that since she's a socialist, she's going to cut the city budget, and then cutting the city budget is going to cut a lot of jobs. And Byron Brown showed some of the job positions that would be lost. And he kept emphasizing the socialist element, and people throughout the city and other, not just the African-American communities, they rallied on his side to put him in office. And one of the critiques about her was she needed to have a broader base of support. And that's why I'm saying if she wants to make a political career, she can do it, but she just needs to keep building a brand name for herself and branching out. But the bottom line, grassroots politician, just like Sherman L. Walker. And I don't know if she knows about Sherman L. Walker. Maybe she does. She's probably heard of him, but I think she would align with him in a lot of ways.
I could probably learn a few lessons as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. How are we doing on time? Let's take a quick look. Okay. What do you think, Ashley? Any concluding questions? We have about maybe 5 to 10 minutes.
Well, I have another one for David.
By all means.
You mentioned the Chinese in Africa, and I have a colleague that he used to go to Africa every year, Ghana, and he emphasized that the Chinese are really coming, getting a stake in Africa. So with the Obama policy, did you see it countering the Chinese influence in maybe Kenya or somewhere else, or what do you think about that?
I think there was some. I think the Obama presidency faced some challenges when it came to dealing with the Chinese, and the fact is, the Chinese were coming with a lot of money. This country's economics were not doing well, and so if somebody is offering you, free interest for X number of years, and we'll build this highway and these airports and and these hospitals, the way it's packaged, if you are president of one of these countries, you're going to say, "Oh yes, I'll take it," right? And so what it did was it was creating a balancing act. So I give, for example, the case I would say more of Kenya, for example. Kenya for many years has been pro-West, very close to the United States. I would say even I think moved a little bit away from UK. Remember it's a former British colony, but actually very closer to the US. And so what happens is, for example, let me give you an example. In Kenya during the colonial times, there was a railway line built in 1896 from the Kenyan coast, town of Mombasa, port city of Mombasa. That railway line went all the way about 800 miles to Uganda. And the idea was to connect the hinterland to the coastline to move things like tea and coffee from what they call the White Highlands and bring it to London for auctioning, right? Because at the time, these were what they call the Crown territories. Mm-hmm. So fast forward to 2013, that railway line from Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya, to Mombasa would take you with the old rail 12 hours. So 2013, the Chinese come in, they build same distance from Mombasa to Nairobi, high-speed rail. So what else was taking you 12 hours, the high-speed rail is taking you 4.5 hours. Mm. And so how do you compete with that? If you go to Ghana, look at the new airports. Same thing in Kenya, look at the highways. And so what happens is the people on the ground, they are resonating with the tangible effect. What they are seeing, oh, the new road, there's a new highway. And so I think that is where the challenge was in terms of not only the Obama administration, even the current administration in dealing with China, because China is saying, we have a non-interference policy, but we're willing to invest. So taking all their extra foreign currency and saying, let's bring in the African continent. The challenge that brings in, again, from let's say the Kenyan perspective, if the Chinese companies coming in to build highways, they also bring in their companies and their people to do the work. So how many of the local people end up doing this project? And so that it creates this friction, and whereby the ruling elite has to figure out how to put a lid and deal with the people, because that is possibility of a time bomb down the road. But again, the challenge is you can resonate in terms of, oh, I can see a highway there where, oh, the Chinese just built, but I don't see anything with our relationship with America that I can say, oh, they did so and so. So I think that is where the challenge was during the Obama administration, and even I think during this current administration. So I think for me, I would argue that's where the issue lie.
Okay. For me, I would be worried about the autonomy of the countries, you know, with these major influences coming in, because if people give resources, strings attached, right? So how much, I would wonder how much the autonomy of these nations are going to be influenced. Because I think about a Kwame Nkrumah and some of his arguments about neo-colonialism and so on and so forth. So aid, help and aid is good, but how much is going to impact the autonomy of the African nation and the African personality, you know?
Yeah.
How much is Chinese society or Western society gonna impact the culture of Africa, where people lose their own identity and begin to take on the identity of these other, you know,
Yeah.
the African personality, you know?
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's a, you know, valid point, because even I think if you look at even times of Nkrumah, remember there's this push and pull as they talk about the Upper Volta, I think the hydroelectric dam in Ghana, with that was funded by Americans, and there was this push and pull. So I think, you know, over time, it's not new, but I think, like you said, this has an impact at the local level, right? Because again, there's string attached. What happens if you don't pay? There's been cases where I think either one of the countries in Central Africa where they had not paid their loans, and the discussion was the Chinese are coming in to take over management of some of the sports because of the pending loans. So it's a dicey issue, because you want development, you want to grow the country, you want to develop the country, yet you don't have the resources. And so because you don't have the resources, somebody else there from Beijing is saying, I'll give you mine to fund it. So we tend to lean, or the African leaders tend to lean on that direction, but without thinking about the future impact. And so what the Obama administration helped start or create was a conversation about that impact. Who's going to pay for these loans? So, for example, in Kenya now, it's very common. For example, Kenya was getting, I think during COVID, loans from IMF or World Bank. And the people were actually writing World Bank saying, do not give them those loans, because at the end of the day, we'll end up paying for those loans. The people in those political offices, they will never pay back. We are now strong in terms of the debt. And so the argument was, the people taking public initiative to write to the IMF and World Bank saying, don't give the government loans, because the money will not go to the destined destination in terms of investment. This is money that's going to end up being, you know, misused through corruption, but we'll end up paying the debt. So it has started the conversation. The conversation is there. People are aware. And of course, I think this idea of open society, the social media, it connects the young people and be able to share ideas and even to challenge the governments in power. So I think there are opportunities and in terms of hope that as time goes by, hopefully some of these young leaders will influence the outcome of future elections, because I think you know, they have to do the heavy lifting, because if they don't do that, then I think people will be in trouble in that continent.
This has been so interesting. I've learned so much from both of you. It'll be really interesting, especially to see where all of this goes with the future of Kenya and international investments in African industry. So we'll definitely have to keep our eyes open on that. But we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you both. Thank you all so much for
Thank you.
the opportunity to speak today. Thank you for delivering such wonderful papers. I learned so much. Chris, would you like to add anything?
It was an excellent conversation, and thank you so much for asking each other questions and for letting us be a part of it. I think now we can officially end our recording.